Thank you for joining us for another episode of Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence. We're a nonprofit membership organization dedicated to helping you streamline your RFP process through better education, smarter strategies, and more transparency. As a member, you'll get access to exclusive training, discounts to our virtual and in-person events, and the chance to connect with other procurement professionals throughout the year. And if you're planning a professional event or conference, don't forget our CPE Speakers Bureau is available to speak at regional and national gatherings. Now let's get into today's session of Ask the RFP Doctor, where one of our expert RFP doctors will show you how to take on real-world challenges in procurement and supply chain management and break them down into practical strategies you can use right away.
Welcome to Ask the RFP Doctor, CPE's monthly web series where we discuss the latest best practices in procurement and supply chain management.
Thank you. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Appreciate your time here. Today, we're going to be walking through some ideas on how to create shorter scopes. And before I kind of dive into the scopes, I thought it was important to kind of understand a couple other activities that impact the type of scope you prepare. So in anything you procure, whether it's a simple construction project to a complicated IT procurement, you generally have 5 major steps where you first plan, then you'll go into your proposal phase. You may have an evaluation phase, contract negotiation, and then award and execution. Within each one of those activities, there's a number of different items that have to occur. And one of those happens to be the scope of work, right? So the scope of work, as we all know, is just one of these many items that we have to go through in a project life cycle. What's important as we go through today is to understand the scope of work cannot be done in a silo from other activities. And what we mean by that is that your scope of work is highly dependent on the type of supplier that you're going to be awarding to. If you get a high-performing supplier, that changes how we need to prepare our scope. If we have a low-performing supplier, that changes how we prepare our scope. Now, we can't go back in time, right? So we don't know who we're going to get, but there are some techniques that can help identify or help us identify the probability of who we're going to get. This picture here, I'm sure you've seen it a number of times, but this, I use this slide to explain just about everything, right? Here we are, we're trying to get this tattoo. This is our scope of work. It is a perfectly accurate scope of work, but that's what we get. What's the problem is it doesn't matter how good our scope of work is when we hired the wrong supplier. And so this is important because as we go through today, or even other classes, as we talk about the scope doesn't always help you predict the outcome. Once again, you could have a perfect scope, but if you hire the wrong vendor, that scope of work really doesn't matter. Now, let me back up. The scope of work matters here. Who does it matter to? What it matters to your lawyers, right? So if you're going to take this person to court, then yes, that perfectly accurate scope of work helps you, but winning in court doesn't minimize your pain, doesn't minimize the suffering you went through, doesn't minimize any of that legwork if you hire the wrong supplier. Now, if you hire the right supplier, yeah, they can provide exactly what you need. So just that's important to keep in mind as we're going through this, is that the scope of work really doesn't help you in terms of predicting your outcomes. If you get a low performer versus a high performer, that impacts the ability of how they're going to interpret your scope. So what are the key drivers that influence that probability of getting either a low or high performer? Really, it comes down to your evaluation process. And very commonly, we have an ITB, IFB process where you focus on lowest price alone versus a value-based process that looks at other items besides price. The main difference is in the low price award, you generally have a higher probability of being stuck with a low performer. Now, what that means is if you're moving forward with a low bid or a price-based award, what that means is that you probably have to do a really good job at outlining your scope of work. Your scope of work needs to be very detailed, very complete. Now, if you're going through an RFP process where you're truly looking to get a high performer, in that case, your scope of work doesn't have to be as detailed and as complete. So for today's presentation, really we're focusing on the assumption that you're not going price-based. If you're going price-based, it's real simple. You have to do the best you can at preparing a perfect scope. Doesn't mean you're going to get a good outcome, but it just means if you have a problem at the end, you have something to fight them with in court. Now, if you're going with a value-based proposition, now you have the ability to start cutting down on the scope of work. Your scope of work no longer has to be perfect if we get a true expert at the end. And so that's what we're going to be focusing on today. So first item, does size of your scope matter? And so we go through a couple examples here. This is a software procurement where the client put together an 80-page scope, very detailed, very comprehensive. On page 23, they identify they have over 5,000 employees. Then page 26, they identify they have 6,500 employees. On that same page, they have a table, but when you add it up, it's 4,000 employees. And page 49 has 5,500 employees. So between these numbers, I mean, you have anywhere from 4,100 to 6,500. In terms of software, I mean, that differential is millions of dollars. And so the challenge with putting together very large, in terms of volume, very large scopes of work is that you increase the probability of having duplication errors or inconsistencies. That results in vendors now all of a sudden giving you apples to oranges prices, right? So that's a big risk. Software procurement number 2. This is a $150 million procurement. Scope of work was 112 pages, and they had over 1,200 items in the Excel file, mandatory requirements. Average proposal size, 700 pages, right? So they went through an RFP process. We were brought in to do a forensic analysis after the fact because this procurement is considered a total failure. 2 years late, and the system doesn't work. $150 million they spent. Right? They assumed that their scope of work was going to protect them, and it didn't. Right? It was a very detailed scope, but once again, having a detailed scope and not hiring a high performer is going to cause you challenges. Next procurement here, this is a $5 million, so much smaller size per project, 5-year term. They spent 4 months trying to prepare the scope. And you can see this is just a table of contents of the scope. 50 pages long. This is just this one section. Lots of different attachments embedded. This is their finance. Once again, similar format, a lot of embedded documents. Went through it. It took almost 45 minutes just to open all of these attachments, 160 pages long. And when this project was procured, they got these results here. They got licenses from 0 to 2,200. A difference in cost was multi-millions of dollars. Once again, apples to oranges. Who did it give a favor to? Well, obviously the vendor that bid 0. Is that fair? No. So once again, a very detailed scope, but it missed some of the most important things, which was user counts or license counts. One more example here, $100 million service. This client hired a consultant. The consultant prepared a scope 1,500 pages long. That's 3 reams of copy machine paper. And the consultant was happy because they obviously got paid. But in terms of issuing this RFP, how many suppliers are going to have time in 3 weeks or 4 weeks that you give them to read 1,500 pages? No one's going to go through that, right? So almost meaningless to your vendors during the proposal period. So what we found is there's actually no correlation between having scopes that are hundreds of pages long to having high performance outcomes. There's no correlation to that. So are we saying that less is better? Well, that's not always the case. In this example, this is another IT example. This is a 5-year term, and you can see here, no budget. I don't know about your experience. In my experience, when a client tells me they don't have a budget for a project, generally that project is going to fail. I mean, I know there's a 90% chance we're going to have problems with this procurement. I don't know why, but it just has something to do with them not having a budget, generally have problems. So they say they don't have a budget, and they're not sure about preparing the scope because they've never done this type of tax system in the past. So we recommended to run a request for needs, which I'm not going to go through today. I think CPE's probably done different presentations on that, but we in essence did a 1-hour virtual call to try and help us with suppliers, to try and help us identify what needs to go into our scope since we've never done this. They gave us all these ideas. Once we gave them back to the subject matter experts, they totally ignored all the requests. They issued the RFP without any of the input. So we just wasted all this time for no reason. So I asked them, well, what's the budget? Do you know the budget yet? Good question. Do we even have approval to proceed? The vendors have asked for this information. Can we get you this, or can we get this to them? The subject matter expert says, when do you need it? We're trying to post next week. Never mind, I'm too busy. They had language on machine learning, which I'm not an IT expert, but reading their language just didn't make sense. So I asked them to maybe clarify or soften the language, and they said, well, we went online and we think it's okay. So that was their response to a lot of things. Well, we just Googled things and we think it's okay. And then this was one of my favorites. They had a requirement here that they need to respond, and this was in the scope. It had the blank, right, to be determined. So I said, we need to give them a time. You can't just say to be determined. The first subject matter expert said, well, vendors will know what that number should be. The second one said, as long as I can get up, go make coffee, and come back to my desk, if the data's there, that's the time it should be. And the third one said, I'm searching the internet right now. It says that 5 seconds is a good number, so let's just make it 3. And that's what they went with. They went with 3 seconds. Right? This is how the client came up with this mandatory technical requirement, literally out of the air. Well, not out of the air. I guess they Googled it, but. So we had a 5-page scope, right? So a much simplified scope. We had some Excel files. During the pre-proposal, the first question is, what do you mean by machine learning? And the subject matter expert's like, yeah, we'll get back to you. Second question, what exactly do you mean with this mandatory requirement? The subject matter expert starts laughing and says, I have no clue. That makes this a joke. We had probably 30 more questions like that. And after the last one, the subject matter experts no longer want to answer because they know they look like fools. So they just stop talking. So it's totally awkward. We get 129 questions. Only 4 are non-scope questions. Here's the difference in pricing. $500,000 to $20 million. Right? So what this tells us, and anytime I see costs that are so varied, it tells us that our scope of work is poor. It tells us that vendors are making different assumptions or have different contingencies. And so our job in preparing the scope is to make sure that these costs come back as apples to apples as possible. So once they got this cost, the client actually canceled this project, right? So we wasted everyone's time. So it's important to understand that just because you're maybe moving away from an ITB or a price-based process to an RFP process doesn't mean you can cut corners. Your scope of work still needs to be complete and accurate. Now, does it need to be 100 pages? Maybe not. But if you're going to go with 5 pages, it better be complete and accurate. Okay, so just a quick highlight. If you're going price-based only, you have a higher probability of getting a low performer, which in our experience means you have to have a bulletproof scope of work. Now, if you're going with a best value approach where you're going to potentially get a high performer, your scope doesn't need to be as perfect. And that's what we're talking about today. Now, the trick here is that most traditional RFP processes give the illusion of best value. They give the illusion that they're not going price-based, but in essence, they're just picking who the evaluators are biased towards, right? Who they prefer. And so that in essence will also result in low performance. And so if you're running an RFP, but your evaluators are just going to pick your favorite, then you have to have a bulletproof scope of work, right? So what we're talking about today is an RFP where you're truly going to award based on best value to a high performer. So in that circumstance, what we can do now is shift our scope from being very prescriptive to more focused on outcomes. What are we looking to achieve? Right? You can only do this if you're truly hiring an expert. So in this example, this is we did a number of projects with United Airlines. They brought us in and they were having really bad performance on some of their simple tasks. And so the facility manager reached out to us and, well, here's some examples. This is examples of painting that was less than 2 years old. And you may not be painting experts, but the most critical part in painting is preparing the surface. And so you can kind of see here in the top right that the painters didn't prep the surface at all. They just painted right over the previous paint that was coming off. And this is an example of flooring. You can't see here, but in this expansion joint, we found like pennies that they didn't even clean. They didn't even sweep the floor. They literally just coated over the existing flooring without any prep work. More examples here, right? Less than 2 years old. So United reached out to us and they said, hey, we're having all these problems. Can you help us write better specs on how to prepare surfaces? Right? So they wanted a better scope of work on how to prep surfaces. And we kind of came back to them and said, well, we could do that, but the challenge, or the issue really isn't the spec. The issue is that you're hiring vendors that need to be told how to prep, whether it's the paint or the flooring. That's the problem. So if we truly want to change the outcome, the spec might not be what you're trying to chase. And so the FM was open to this. So the first thing we tackled was their painting. So in their traditional painting approach, where they went price-based, they had a very detailed scope and they had technical spec. And so they had how to prep surfaces. Now, it wasn't as complete, so they wanted us to improve that, but they had their spec. In our new approach, what we did is we cut down the scope of work. Our scope of work, we basically said, here's the color of the paint. We didn't have any prep specifications, but we provided them with our current issues and challenges, which included improper prepping. And then this was a 24-hour in operations airport. So nothing can be shut down. We can't impact the airplanes. That was the scope. The difference was traditionally we had a 15-page scope. In this approach, we had a 2-page scope. Now, it wasn't just the scope. We also changed the approach. So we went from going straight low bid to hiring an expert, right? So we reduced the scope, but we went with hiring an expert. So by doing that, the expert, Now, they weren't the cheapest, but they weren't the most expensive. However, they were significantly longer than our low bidders. And that's why, because their approach to prep was significantly different here. So here's kind of an example of cracks in their parapet walls. This painter came in and said, we're going to obviously scrape it all by hand. Then we're going to epoxy inject all the cracks. Once it's sealed, then we come back, prime the walls, and then paint it. Right? So outstanding work there. These are their hangers. They said instead of just doing a power wash, which all the low bidders said that was their prep work, they would do the power wash first, then by hand scrape all of these hangers. Then by hand, they would go through prime and then paint it with the rollers. They said painting with a roller allows us to get better coverage, thicker material than just using a paint sprayer. So they took longer, but the final results were unbelievable. What they were painting generally every 2 to 3 years. We came back to this site 7 years later, and the FM had said the painting work still looks unbelievable. They said it's dirty. We come in once a year, we power spray it, but once it's power sprayed, it looks almost brand new. All right, so they're recoating every 2 to 3 years. With an expert, they're at 7 years without touching it. And once again, we were able to reduce our scope from the 15, 20 pages down to 2. Another example here at United was they had these old barrel-shaped hangers. They were probably built in the 50s. And the issue was the deck was deteriorating. It was kind of like Swiss cheese. They didn't know how to re-roof it. Once again, we went with a more outcome-based scope of work. We said we wanted to re-roof this for the longest possible period of time. We're not going to tell you how to re-roof it or what to do, but here are the risks. Here are the challenges. The deck is in bad shape. And once again, in operation airport, we can't shut anything down. We had a 2-page scope. The vendor that was selected, the roofer here, basically said, what we're going to do is we're going to install tracks on the outside of your roof. We're going to build this enclosed booth. And in this booth, we're then going to, you can kind of see it here, it's going to go up and down the roof. And within this booth, we're going to spray the foam and the coating. And that's how we can minimize any risk to the airplanes outside. Once again, 2-page scope of work, the vendors came out with a solution. Now, this only worked because the procurement approach allowed us to hire an expert, right? So if we just did a 2-page scope and went with our favorite roofer, we might not get this performance. United did this on many other services, FM services on site. Best projects the FM had ever seen in 20 years there, was able to reduce his management by 75%, right? Outstanding performance. Now, most of these examples are very simplified scopes, right? Painting, roofing, where it's easy to say, here's the outcome. Is this going to work for every project? The answer is no. Like, you can't say, build me a new hospital for the best value, and here's 1 page. Right? That's probably not going to work. You're going to need more details, but it can work for more complicated projects. In this example, this was a dining service contract we did for a university, $80 million. The scope of work we had, really the ultimate scope was to increase financial return. And then they had a bunch of sub goals here, which turned out to be 5 pages. Right, so we're able to do this $80 million project, the scope of work in 5 pages. Now, I kind of highlighted it with some of the United examples. It might be simplified to identify your goals and objectives as the scope, but what's really important is also identifying your current conditions or your existing situations. And so in this case, we had 5 pages per scope, but our existing conditions was 15 pages. right? And this is where all the meal counts, the volumes, the sales, all that data of the past year is important still. So some people don't consider existing conditions part of the scope, which if you don't, that's fine. But it's important to understand that the existing conditions is critical and it can be as important as your scope of work, right? So don't overlook your existing conditions. So in total, we had about 20 pages between the scope and existing conditions. Did we have to tell them what restaurants to provide, what locations, what hours, what equipment, what food safety requirements? The answer is no. None of that was in the scope. Now, you may think, well, if we don't identify our food safety requirements, like what happens if we award the contract and there's food safety issues? We're at risk. You're right. You are at risk in the traditional approach. Now, in the approach that we take, and we're not going through that approach today, but in our procurement process, what we have is a step prior to award where the top rated vendor comes in and provides all the details you want to see. So even though our scope had like 1 or 2 sentences on food safety, prior to award, this vendor was required to come in and give us their 100-page safety plan. And at that point, the university was able to go through and say, yes, we like all this except for, these 3 items. Can we change these items? And so once again, that's how you can get away from having a 100-page scope if you have a process, one, that allows you to hire a high performer, but also 2, provides a mechanism for that high performer to fill in all the details prior to award. This is a software procurement. This is a tax system for a state. This is to provide all the taxes from the interstate semi trucks that come through the state. So it's a smaller procurement, $3 million, 8 years. We help them prepare the background, current conditions, scope, and the requirements. You can see here, this was a small software procurement, but a 4-page scope for any software is very streamlined. We were able to go with the highest performer. That vendor was able to finish the project not only on time, but without any cost increases, meaning any vendor or any owner-related cost increases. So 0 change orders. And the client was 100% satisfied. All right. This is pretty unusual for IT. Once again, that 4-page scope only worked because we have a mechanism prior to award to get all the details. I think this might be the last example here. This is janitorial or custodial services. This is for a large facility, 90 different buildings, 7 million square feet. The challenge here was this organization, their incumbent they've had on site for 40 years. And so now to run a procurement, they actually don't have a previous RFP they can look to or a previous scope. So they asked us to come in and help them develop the scope because they didn't even know where to start. So we came in, we kind of have a portfolio of projects. So we were able to look at, 10 previous janitorial projects. We helped put this together. Obviously now with AI, and I'm sure probably CPE's done presentations on AI, but with AI, we were able to, what used to take maybe months to put together, we were able to put this together in 2 to 3 weeks. It's significant what AI can do. But anyway, we were able to put this scope together, about 22 pages, once again, for a $40 million service. The question was, is our scope accurate or have we missed anything? And the answer is, I don't know. I'm not a janitorial or custodial expert. I just know I've looked at some others and here's the similarities. So what we did is, once again, we reached out to the suppliers, ran a request for needs. We had a virtual call, and asked these vendors or suppliers, how good is our scope? Is there anything missing? Is there anything we need to do to minimize your assumptions or contingencies? And so they came back, they had some ideas. We updated our scope, and we ended up getting 23 different proposals. This was, once again, a $40 million budget. The average cost came in at $38 million. And the amazing thing here, and I can't show you the costs, but the like first year costs, and if we went down the list, like vendor 1 came in at 6.1 million, vendor 2 came in at 6.1 million, vendor 3 came in at 6.2 million, 6.2 million, 6.2 million, 6.3 million, 6.3, and all the way down. Like, all these vendors were so close to one another in cost. The variance was less than 9%. And what that tells us is that the scope was very complete and accurate. Now, maybe it wasn't accurate, but the scope was very complete in terms of the vendors didn't have to make any assumptions, because the costs were almost identical between 23 different firms. So that tells us we did a great job minimizing the apples to oranges assumptions that can happen in a poor scope. And we've done some research. This is just a quick analysis, 11 different projects. What we analyze is the quality of the scope. And what we found is that as your scope of work becomes better, then the variance in your costs goes down. So just like this similar example here, right? As the scope of work is better, the variance in cost goes down. Whereas one of those first examples, if you remember, where the scope was bad and they had different assumptions, and the difference was multi-millions of dollars. So what is a good scope of work? Once again, CPE probably has different seminars on this. In essence, we have the overview, a timeline, financial constraints, goals, technical and unique considerations, items 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6. So everything besides 5. All of those are probably 1 page on anything you're procuring. And it's normally going to be item 5 that is going to be the meat of your scope. So item 5 is, once again, what you can adjust. If you have a process to help you select an expert, with item 5, you can start shifting from being very prescriptive in item 5 to being more focused on the outcomes versus on how they're going to get there. But once again, that can only be done if your process is going to allow you to select a true expert. And then also, with all of this, keep in mind that your current conditions or existing state or background information is as important as your scope of work. So don't overlook that existing state. So those are the things you can kind of tackle in terms of trying to minimize or shorten your scope, right? Focusing more on outcomes versus then details on how they have to get there.
This has been Ask the RFP Doctor, brought to you by the Center for Procurement Excellence.